Now that we learned equivalence partitioning and boundary value analysis, let's talk about some important notes about these two techniques. These notes are very important and they will help you in understanding these two techniques in a better way. Note number one, each value belongs only to one partition. So in equivalence partitioning or boundary value analysis, each value, any value, must belong to only one partition. We cannot have one value that is part of two partitions at the same time. We cannot say that this value is between the two partitions. In this case, this value is a separate partition that should be tested on its own. 2. Equivalence partitioning can be applied to both input or output values. So, most of the times when we deal with equivalence partitioning or boundary value analysis, we deal with input values that come from the user, that the user enters, and we as testers enter them to the system, then we watch the output of them and compare it to the expected result. But this is not the case every time. Sometimes our goal in equivalence partitioning or boundary value analysis is to measure the output. So in this case, we provide the input to the system that makes these outputs happen, that makes the output partitions covered. Also, of course, boundary value analysis is like equivalence partitioning. It can be applied to both input or output values. We have two types of partitions, valid and invalid partitions. Like we said, valid partitions are the normal partitions. These are the partitions that the system is designed to deal with them. Invalid partitions are the partitions that have abnormal or invalid behavior. Both types of partitions should be tested unless it is stated in the requirements that we should only test the valid partitions. Equivalence partitioning coverage. What is equivalence partitioning coverage and how do we measure it? Equivalence partitioning coverage is the number of partitions covered by test cases divided by the total number of partitions. So for example, if we have 5 partitions in our system and we covered 4 of them using test cases, in this case, equivalence partitioning coverage is 4 out of 5 or 80%. Also, boundary value analysis coverage is the number of boundaries covered by test cases divided by total number of boundaries in the system. So for example, if we have 10 boundaries in the system and we tested 7 out of them, so in this case, the boundary value analysis coverage is 70%. 7. Testing two values from the same partition doesn't increase the coverage. If we have a partition, for example, it ranges from 1 to 10. If we test only one value from this partition, this means that this partition is covered. If we test two values from this partition, this does not increase the coverage. We must have one test case per partition. There is no problem in testing more than one test case per partition, but this will not increase the coverage. Another important note, you might go to a technical exam if you are applying for a job or you are reading a textbook about software testing and you find these two letters, EP. Some people use abbreviations when they talk about test techniques. So equivalence partitioning is called EP. Also, boundary value analysis, some people call it BVA. So, if you are in an exam or an interview and someone says BVA, you should understand that he means boundary value analysis. If he says EP, he means equivalence partitioning.